Greetings again, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. I've been going through the book called Confident Faith, and so I've worked my way a little over halfway through the book, and we've started in on this next major section called How Science and Logic Point Towards Spiritual Truth. And what he's going to develop here, I say he, that's Mark Mittelberg, what he's going to develop here are 20 arguments. And he says, no, they're not all going to be as equally compelling to each reader, but he said he thinks these provide a cumulative case that really point powerfully to the claims of the Christian worldview. So in the last podcast, I covered arrow number 1. He calls them 20 arrows that point toward Christianity. So I'll call them the same thing, 20 arrows. But basically, it's just 20 different arguments for the truth of Christianity. And the first one was design in the universe. Design requires a designer. And so let's move along. His second one is fine-tuning. He says that in the universe points to an intelligent and intentional fine-tuner. And he said we're discovering more and more constants in physics that point to the universe being finely tuned for it to have life, for us to be here. And I guess you can think of it like a wall full of dials. I mean, just hundreds of dials. And you have to turn every one of those in a precise way and to a precise point, or you don't get life at all. And he mentions astrophysicist Hugh Ross. I like his material a lot. He's well, now he's retired, but he was the president of Reasons to Believe. And he put a book out called The Creator and the Cosmos. And he gives just dozens of examples in areas where the universe had to fall within just a very narrow tolerance for any kind of life to exist. And he says if this is happening randomly, it's just the odds are just incredibly poor on that would come about. There's a quote here from Paul Davies, who's a physicist and a cosmologist. He's an astrobiologist. And he says, you look at all of the conditions of the universe and all the fundamental laws, and he said, the universe has just the right conditions to sustain life. He says, this is Paul Davies now, who's not a Christian, by the way. He says the impression of design is overwhelming. And he goes on to point out that scientists over these, let's say, 30 years or so, have discovered just about everything about the basic structure of the universe is balanced just on the most narrow edge for life to exist. And there's a quote here from a man named Collins. Let me see if I can find his first name. Robin Collins. He's got a book out called God and Design, the Teleological Argument in Modern Science. And he says the fine-tuning has conservatively been estimated to be 1 part in 100 million billion. That'd be 10 followed by 53 zeros. Now that's pretty precise. He makes the comparison here. He says, let's say you're way out in space and you want to throw a dart toward the Earth. You just sling it. And it says it'd be like hitting a bullseye that's 1/trillionth of an inch in diameter. That's the less than the size of one solitary atom. And you're out in space when you do this. Good luck, huh? Well, there's a former atheist, Mittelberg quotes, named Patrick Glenn. He has a book called God, the Evidence. He says, today the concrete data points strongly in the direction of the God hypothesis. It's the simplest and most obvious solution. So there's arrow number 2. Why do we believe there's a God? Why do we think the Christian message is true? We'll get more to the Christian aspects in a minute, but at least at this point we're talking about the existence of God. So arrow number 2, well, let me go back. Let's always do kind of a recap. Number 1 is design in the universe, fine-tuning in the universe. Here's arrow number 3, DNA. That's information. And he quotes Francis Collins, who is head of the Human Genome Project that mapped out the entire DNA. He says this newly revealed text was 3 billion letters long and written in a 4-letter code. 4-letter code. So he said it says if you printed these letters out in a regular font size on a normal bond paper and you bound all of those papers together, you'd end up with a tower the height of the Washington Monument. So that's so much information, so complex. And of course, Collins' book has the title The Language of God. Yeah. So it says there's biological language there. I've read somewhere that I think it was Bill Gates said this is the most complicated computer code everywhere. It's biological language. And Mittelberg points out information is not recorded and communicated by mere chance. It says, you've got 3 billion letters long and written in a 4-letter code. It's our own instruction booklet previously known only to God. Now, Dean Kenyon, who's a biophysicist from San Francisco State University, he was trying to, he co-authored a book trying to explain how life came about without any supernatural involvement, but he made a turnaround. He repudiated the conclusions of his own book. He said he became very suspicious of all naturalistic theories of how we came to be here because of what? That complexity of the cell and the information-bearing properties of DNA. He thinks that's the best evidence that points toward a designer. Here's what Dean Kenyon said. This new realm of molecular genetics is where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the earth. So there's arrow number 3, DNA information. You only get information from a mind. Here's arrow number 4. Why else do we think there's a God? The beginning of the universe. It's called the cosmological argument. And here it is, really simple form. Whatever has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, you can fill in the blank. The universe had a cause. So it's really simple. Anything that has a beginning has a cause. You hear a knock at the door, and somebody is doing that knocking, right? So that's the source of the knock. So whatever has a beginning has a cause, and now we know the universe had a beginning. So therefore, the universe has to have a cause, and it can't be itself. A knock can't knock itself at your door. Something has to knock. The universe can't bring itself into existence. It needs something outside of the universe. What do we call that? Outside of nature, we call that supernatural or supernature. I like this. He quotes from Robert Jastrow, an astronomer who's a founder of the founding director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He had a book called God and the Astronomers. He said 5 lines of evidence, including motions of the galaxies and the primordial fireball, the laws of thermodynamics, the abundance of helium in the universe, the life story of the stars. He said we have one conclusion. Everything indicates the universe had a beginning. Now, at one time, nobody believed that. They thought the universe had always been here. Therefore, you didn't need a creator. It was just always here, but not anymore. In the 20th century, they realized the Big Bang was the case of the universe getting started. Stephen Hawking, he says, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning. When? At the Big Bang, he says. And then Mittelberg says that makes us realize something outside of the universe had to cause it. I love this quotation. He's got a quote from Robert Jastrow again at the end of his book, God and the Astronomers. This is worth quoting. Love it. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. So if you go back to Genesis, I think that's what he's referring to here. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So now, science is starting to catch up to Genesis. Isn't that funny? Here's arrow number 5. Why else do we think there is a God? The sense of morality. He says, all of us have an internal standard of morality that is above us and is outside of us. Why do we say that? Because everybody has it, but we don't live up to it. Why in the world, he says, would we invent a code of ethics we couldn't fulfill and then employ it to frustrate and condemn ourselves all life long? He says, well, just to make it clear, Mittelberg says our standards are not exactly the same, but there is a universal sense of right and wrong that every person has. Every person has that. He quotes C.S. Lewis, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right or wrong, you'll find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he'll be complaining, it's not fair. And Mittelberg says that some people will argue that this moral sense came about because of the society that we live in. Now, Mittelberg says, well, that may be partially true, but certain aspects of our moral understanding transcend culture. It transcends it. So where do we get this sense of right and wrong? A moral lawgiver, he says. That's what is above and beyond us. Because if you don't have God, what do you have? It's just one person saying, hey, I don't like what you're doing. The other person saying, so what? Where are the standards? He says God's law is written in our hearts. He has a quote at the end of this section here, summed up by Lee Strobel as far as this whole point. Without God, Morality is simply the product of sociobiological evolution. And just basically, he says, a question of taste or personal preference. So that was my comment before. If somebody does something you don't like, all you can say is, I don't like what you're doing. And which they could respond with, so. And so you're just going back and forth about what you don't like. But if there's a standard beyond us, we can all look to that standard to find out what's right and wrong. Back to Strobel's quote, without God there is no absolute right and wrong that imposes itself on our conscience. But we know deep down that objective moral values do exist. He says some actions like rape and child torture, for example, are universal moral abominations, and this means God exists. So our sense of morality does imply the existence of a moral lawgiver. So Mittelberg sums up this section of his book. He said, we believe there's a divine creator. Why? The start of the universe with a bang shaped it with design and detail, fine-tuned it for precise tolerances to support life like us, the encoding of DNA, that information that we see, the language of DNA, and then created us with a perversive and inescapable sense of morality. So those are the big issues. Why do we think there's a God? Well, real quickly, it's the cosmological argument, looking at the universe. There's the teleological argument, looking at design, including DNA, and there's the moral argument. So those are the big three. Now, he moves ahead, and I've got enough time, I think, to do one or two more of his arrows. Now he focuses on the Bible. Okay, so far he's been talking about why do we think there's a God. Now he's going to go to evidences for the Bible. He said, point number 6, the Bible shows itself to be a uniquely consistent religious book. He said it has all sorts of evidence for its divine authorship. He said it's consistent. He said, think about it. The Bible's not one book. It's a collection, isn't it? It's 66 books written over something like 1,500 years by about 40 authors. They're using different languages, containing hundreds of topics, but there's an amazing unity of theme. It's all about Jesus. And he says each part of the Bible is kind of like a symphony. It's orchestrated by one master. So he takes the Gospels, and he said, think about the Gospel that's not included in the 4 that we have, the Gospel of Thomas. Well, why isn't that in there? Because it doesn't add to this cohesive and unified message. Now, for example, here's something from the Gospel of Thomas, just so you can see how different it is from the other 4. In saying 14, this is what Jesus tells his disciples. If you fast, you will bring sin upon yourselves, and if you pray, you will be condemned, and if you give to charity, you will harm your spirits. What? Saying 1:14 has this. This is Jesus again. Every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow, how about this one? Blessings on the lion. If a human eats it, making the lion human. Foul is the human. If a lion eats it, making the lion human. He says, what? Fasting leads to sin. Giving to charity damages your spirit. Women have to make themselves into men to get into heaven. Lions who eat humans become humans themselves. He said, does that make any sense to you? He said, you can see this, that the biblical Gospels and the other parts of the Bible all weave themselves together in that one consistent message. All right, here's arrow number 7, another point in favor of the divine aspect of the Bible. It's a uniquely historical religious book. Boy, I think this is huge. I mean, you think like the Quran and the Buddha's sayings and things like that, they're not tied to history at all. They just kind of float out there in abstractions. But we have, for example, Luke, he says. Luke starts his gospel saying this, many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. He talks about the eyewitnesses reported things. He says, I have decided to write a careful account. So it was written down very early, soon after the events. He said, Mittelberg says, there are some outdated rumors that say the New Testament Gospels were very, very far removed from the time of Jesus, but no, that's not true. He gives an example. One person who had that idea about how far removed the Gospels were from the events of Jesus' life, it was a theologian named John A.T. Robinson. He did a lot more research. He actually flipped everything around on its head. He repudiated his claims, and he wrote a book titled Redating the New Testament. And he argues the whole New Testament was written before AD 70. And so it said it's clear the entire New Testament was completed within a generation of Christ's death and resurrection. There are still people living that could vouch for its accuracy. So I think that's really important. Something I've spoken on to classes is the use of creeds that are in Paul's letters. Just take a look sometime, like 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. There's a creed there that Paul did not invent. He said he was given it to him, and he passed it on to others. That creed is dated to within a year or two of the resurrection of Jesus. So we've got things that go way, way back. He said the other way you can tell how historical the New Testament is the line of disciples who wrote and affirmed what had been taught from the very beginning. Even the early church fathers, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement, they have the same story. That's called chain of custody. And it says various details of the New Testament claims are reinforced by outside reports. Thallus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, and others. He said all you have to do is look at things like the Quran. It makes all sorts of claims about Jesus' life and teachings, but how far was that? It was hundreds of years, 600 years later, and 600 miles from the scene. These claims that are in there are contradicted by eyewitness accounts written by people who were actually with Jesus and wrote first-hand biographies about him. He also looks at the Book of Mormon. Much of that is not supported by history or archaeology. Hindu writings, they don't make any historical claims. So he said, if you do that kind of a comparison, you'll see the Bible shines as a book with impressive historical credentials. So I'll leave it at that, and I think I'll stop here, and we'll pick up Arrow 8 next time. Thanks so much for paying attention to this, and I hope you're having a good day.